you ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor and I'm joined as ever by the inflatable Ian Hardingham.
Hello Mr. Paul Kilduff-Taylor. I don't think I ever told you that Microsoft actually asked me to do the theme tune for Windows 95, but they gave me 30 seconds, and when I said no, they gave Brian Eno a lot less. Not sure what was going on there.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Trine 3 developers Frozenbyte are disputing allegations that they have released an unfinished game. Apparently the game was always intended to end on a cliffhanger, with further parts being released depending on the game's success, but they admit that they may have failed to adequately communicate this to their players. Quote, "The future of the series is now in question as the feedback, user reviews and poor media attention has caught us by surprise," said Frozenbyte Vice President Joel Kinnunen. Ian Hardingham, is this the start of the great indie crash?
I don't actually think that this is part of the larger, what one might call an indie game crash. I find Trine 3 about the most boring game I can possibly imagine. And I think that's obviously personal to me. A lot of people like it. But I think this was a case of them changing the genre. It used to be a 2D platformer, now it's a 3D platformer, and that annoyed people. There's some question to me here about... A lot of the narrative here is about the bad reaction and the bad what the fans are saying about the game, and not so much about the sales. On the other hand, it just sounds really like they're also very unhappy with how the game is selling. So even though they're talking mostly about people saying it's too short and people saying that it ends on a cliffhanger, I think that it's pretty clear that the sales have been bad. But I just think it's a bit of an uninspiring game.
I think that's true. I mean, we talk a lot about how it's difficult to separate out these different factors. A lot of the narrative here is around the fan reaction to the ending. There are plenty of successful games which have negative fan reactions to the ending and negative sentiments about how long they are. So I think it's probably fair to say that those two things aren't related. Elsewhere, they've said that they spent a huge amount of money on this game. I think it was something like $5 million. As we'll see later, they were given a grant from the European Union to put into the budget for the game. So it's a really high budget, kind of high risk exercise. And I think probably the story here is really that Trine was very successful in about 2010, Trine 2 similarly in 2012, and then this, trying to be even more ambitious on the top of those two things, just absolutely didn't work for them. Maybe people are kind of over the Trine thing now.
I think if you're going to make a sequel, don't change the genre of the game. I don't think it's a terrible idea for them to make a 3D platformer using all of the experience that they've gained from making Trine 1 and 2. I think that's a fun idea. I don't think that should be Trine 3. I think that there's a very clear set of things that you should do with a sequel, and changing the genre of the game is not one of them. So that's the first thing I want to say about it. The second is about budget. You're right, I think they said the budget was about $4.6 million, or about twice as much as the previous one. In general, there is a real tendency for people who make a hit in any medium really to spend a lot more money on the next product, and I think that's exactly something that people shouldn't be doing. And the worst thing you can possibly do is spend all of the money that you've made from your first game on your next game, because it's a hit driven business and you cannot guarantee that second hit. That's something that Jonathan Blow has done with The Witness, and I think he has a very serious chance of losing money on that. He amusingly has been on Twitter sort of pointing out the fact that there are a lot of good indie games that aren't making much money at the moment, when I think someone needs to point that out to him 2 years ago. So I think there are a couple of different things going on here, But yeah, if you want to make Trine 3, I think you just need to make the third Trine game.
Yeah, I think there's a good argument there. I think there are some sequels which change some fundamental things about the game which can do very well. So knowing what to change is very difficult. I basically agree with you. Changing genre, as they kind of effectively have, is very high risk. Also, as you said, doubling down on a sequel is probably just about one of the highest risk things you can do. It's very close in risk to spending a large amount of money on a completely new IP, despite the fact that what people think. Indie games have a much less valuable ongoing IP than a AAA game does, simply because they don't do as much marketing. So fewer people have heard of the name of the game or the idea of the game when the second one comes out. I think what we're seeing a lot of indie developers do, and maybe we've been guilty of this to some extent, is to have kind of AAA thinking, but without some of the secondary benefits that the slightly crazy world of AAA marketing brings.
Yeah, I mean, as usual, the voice of sensibility just says, work out how you can be sustainable as a company and keep your budgets relatively consistent. If you've got a huge amount of income from one of your games, that means you can maybe spend some money on a few more bells and whistles for your next game, maybe hire your favourite voice actor or something. But in terms of doubling your budget, or even more than that, that's a really bad idea. Yeah, I just want to qualify what I was saying about sequels. I think, especially when you're making the third in a series, that it's sort of especially weird to change things massively at that point. There have been some really great sequels that were quite significantly different to the original game. I'm thinking of stuff like Dune, for instance.
Yep.
Dune 1 and 2, and there are a few other games that are a bit like that. That often happens when the first game is sort of reasonably successful and makes enough money to sequel, and the people decide to do something quite different. It seems to me that really does usually happen, specifically not when the first game is like a massive runaway success. So, as usual, the calculus here is pretty difficult, but this is just one of those things which seems obvious once you've seen it happen, but probably didn't feel obvious at the time. You don't want to change something so significant about a game that you are making to cash in on the popularity of that IP.
I think also there's another issue that they've had here, which is this idea of ongoing story. I mean, I think they were kind of setting up for a sequel. I mean, they explicitly said the ending is a cliffhanger. And I think that trying to set up for sequels and trying to position your game within a hypothetical future series is really dangerous. I think that when you make a game, it's best to consider it as the sort of be-all and end-all of that idea. I think that that's kind of the only way you can make something really great. We've seen it with certain sequels, especially sequels that get handed off to other developers. For them, that's their one chance to work on the X franchise, and that kind of makes the game feel more complete and it feels more worthwhile in itself. I think it's a very rare title where people will absolutely fall in love with just a kind of incremental advance in that. Maybe some AAA games have that. I don't think indie games do. So you have to really treat every game as if it's the last game in the series, I think.
Yeah, I have several responses to that. The first is, I think it's hard from inside the development studio to understand what counts as a big advancement. I think it can feel when you're working on a sequel that there's nothing new about what you're doing, but something relatively simple that feels to you like a natural progression, that as an idea you had in the first one, actually feels like a huge difference to the players. I mean, I'm thinking about the Mario games and looking at the ways in which they have advanced from game to game, and something as simple as a new power-up can make the whole game feel completely different. So I think that's quite difficult to do as a developer. When it comes to this this cliffhanger ending problem, I was reading about this, and apparently they'd originally designed the game to be 3 times as large, and they said that would have cost $15 million to make, which they weren't going to do. So they decided that rather than rewrite it, they would literally only release the first third of the story. The intention being that if it was as successful as they expected, then they could fill that out later. And that really smacks of worse than the kind of misdecision you were talking about, and just like a bit of development hell, and just a bad thing to have happened. So I think it would be really interesting to see what would have happened if Trine 2 was very similar to Trine 1 and 2, was still a 2D platformer, looked very similar, was still really good, but only had the first third, because it's impossible to separate that issue from the other issue here.
Yeah, that's very true. I think Frozen Byte are going to be okay, actually, based on kind of, they really seem to have internalized some of this stuff. It was interesting, they chose to release this video basically apologizing for what happened very extensively to their community, and I think that's a very good and sort of modern indie thing to do, to kind of own up to it and go, yeah, we didn't do this right and we don't feel happy about that. So I feel like with the development experience that they've had, they could well bounce back in the future, just because I feel like they're taking this the right way. So we wish them well, I guess.
Yeah, being an indie is all about being fluffy and being nice to the people and being very different from the corporates, so I can't wait to make a video with you where we apologise for something.
I'd like to apologise for you. The Taxpayers Alliance have singled out video games as the largest focus of their ire, the latest focus of their ire, in fact, but let's go with largest. Apparently, British taxpayers contributed around £270,000 out of a total of $2.4 million in grants to various game developers during 2014. For some reason, particular emphasis was given to the upcoming title Ship Emergency Simulator, perhaps because the developer described the game as fairly undramatic. This is a game that, quote, features accurate models of real-life transport vessels and faithfully mimics the daily life on ships, close quote. Ian Hardingham, should taxpayers be subsidising video games?
Yes, I think taxpayers should be subsidising all of the creative arts to an appropriate extent. And the thing that is absolutely hilarious about this is a really great story, and I love Ship Emergency Simulator, and I'm going to pay a lot more attention to it now. The whole thing about government and the taxpayer funding art is that the government does not then turn around and decide specifically which art it's going to fund. The whole thing about governments doing this is to allow grassroots stuff to emerge, and the Taxpayers Alliance, you know, it's good to have organisations like this that spend a lot of time trolling and complaining about stuff the government does. That's just straightforwardly good for us, so I don't want to give them too much of a hard time. And I'm sure that a lot of their constituency will think this is absolutely ridiculous and get really up in arms in it, and I think they probably completed their goals with that. But look, Ship Emergency Simulator sounds to me like a game that could do amazingly well on Steam.
Yeah,
it could both be artistically valid and really profitable.
Right.
So this whole thing's pretty silly.
Ship Emergency Simulator, I think, is a guaranteed hit, especially now that it's the symbol of kind of creative triumph and expression. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's good to have this kind of scrutiny on stuff. I think, you know, saying, hang on a minute, like, we didn't know this money was being spent on this, and let's have a discussion about that. That's actually very useful. There is this kind of, you said the government doesn't decide what gets the money. What tends to happen is they sort of basically outsource that decision to Aquango, effectively, some kind of sort of pseudo-governmental organisation. And I think that's where some of these problems can happen. So you always see these stories about, you know, oh, this person got an Arts Council grant to freeze themselves in a block of ice wearing a Mickey Mouse hat for 6 months. And, you know, how does that benefit the country? I think the problem is that those kind of discussions about what should get money are so complicated that they can't really even be made democratically. They have to basically be made on an arbitrary basis by a bunch of people sitting around going, do we think this is cool? I guess so. And I can understand why people aren't satisfied with that. I think that's quite a difficult and weird process.
Yeah, I think the decision should be more based around saying, is this person competent enough to complete the thing that he said he's going to complete? Is it of a reasonable scale? Has he got a good plan for it, and not be looking at the artistic validity of the thing that's coming out, you know, beyond sort of very vague things like, is this original? Is this maybe slightly British? That kind of thing. That's sort of how I think it should work. But I just want to say that I have never been sadder to be in the medium of radio than I am today, because there is a brilliant picture of David Braben on this independent article, which is just the most brilliant thing, and I can't share it with you. So we'll put it on the blog, and you need to look at his face because it's absolutely hilarious.
It is good. He looks very happy, and he's got one of those kind of side sportscaster mics stuck to his cheek, like he's just about to kind of drop an amazing comment on someone's dunk. It is pretty good. We should share that picture with you. Yeah, kind of wrapping this up, I think that it's just fantastic that we're now in a situation where games are receiving the same anger that performance art, novels and so on were receiving kind of in the 80s with Arts Council grants and so on, although this isn't the traditional Arts Council. So it's nice. I guess that's one facet of being a creative medium, is that elements of the right massively dislike you having money. Gamasutra had an interesting article last week about the effects of working on gross and or violent games. They spoke to artists and animators about what it was like to have been immersed in violent and disturbing imagery for months at a time. Do we need to start thinking about the impact of a game's content on those developing it as well as those playing it?
I mean, probably not. Generally, it's sort of your choice to work at a company, and hopefully we're not breaking any EU regulations when we ask someone to animate a Mortal Kombat fatality. I started off being pretty dubious of this whole idea, but when I started reading this article, I was reminded of just how horribly violent games are, and some of the really crazy things that can happen. Some interesting things from this. The animators and the programmers say that they don't tend to have the worst time, because the programmers are just working on code, obviously, and the animators are generally working on sort of untextured things, not properly modelled things, so they don't get the full visceral impact of the extreme strangeness. The one guy who said he was most affected was making a Halo level set in some intestines.
Yes.
And that's pretty disgusting. I'm really fed up of playing games that have levels set in intestines. It really bores me. It seems that now it's almost as common as the traditional jungle, desert, mountain, volcano, moon level thing. Let's stop doing that. One of the funniest things was that he started becoming an outcast at work because everyone would feel physically ill whenever they looked at his monitor, which does actually sound pretty bad. So, I don't know. I'm glad that we're not making a game like this.
Yeah, I think that there's some complexities here. Like, people's mental health at work is a kind of huge issue. And if you're in a company, you may not necessarily have signed up to work on footage of someone being hung, which is one of the people was talking about that. So I do think that there should be some consideration given to people who have to suddenly, with no preparation that they haven't signed up for, work with a load of, frankly, very disturbing content. The extent to which stuff disturbs you, there's quite a lot of interesting talk about desensitization in this article. I think that sort of gore and viscera are things that it's actually sort of mostly because of our society that we're so amazingly offended by those things. So there are things like that which are kind of, you can sort of deprogram yourself from those feelings relatively easily. I think most people can if they sort of put effort into it. So there's that. I mean, I feel conflicted about this. You and I both don't really like this kind of game, and I just don't know what it's like to kind of have to force people to work on it.
Yeah, I'm sure if you're working at a company and they decide to make the next Manhunter or something, then you don't really have much of a choice apart from quit, which isn't a great choice. So I actually agree with you. There could be a workplace ethical issue there. I mean, I always would have thought that the worst aspect of this would come from the writing, really. I find the most upsetting things myself is not graphic imagery, but writing about sort of evil in people and the evil things that people can do. I don't know what it felt like being Bret Easton Ellis while he was writing American Psycho. I don't know what it's like when you're trying to direct a torture porn film. Those things all sound a bit disgusting to me, and I'm just a bit old now, and I don't really... I like to focus on the happiness in life. So I don't know, should there be a union that protects artists from having to work on the next intestine level?
It's a kind of thing that a union would do. I mean, given how sort of poor employment stuff is in games industry anyway, it's unlikely that would happen. But I do think it's a kind of interesting factor because a lot of people don't really have a say in it in these bigger companies, and I think it would be good if you are planning to work on this kind of content, if you sit people down and go like, we're going to be working on this stuff and you might have to deal with it. I just don't think it's taken seriously enough is what I'm saying. I think games have probably transitioned now to the state where there's a lot of very realistic stuff like this, and it's going to start affecting people more and more and more.
Maybe just like people who work on oil platforms get danger pay, maybe you should get like gross pay.
Yes.
You should have a small bonus if you're working on something horrible.
I like that idea. John Blythe wrote an editorial for Eurogamer at the weekend about the Fruit Machine game Microsoft have developed for Windows 10. Apparently you have to either watch adverts or pay real money in order to get coins to play the game, but perhaps in order to avoid gambling legislation, the game doesn't offer a way to cash out these coins if you manage to win a big jackpot. Also, the number of coins you're allowed to bet increases the more you play, meaning the best value coin pack, which costs £155, could only get you around 40 goes in the later stages. Ian Hardingham, what do you think about this, and is there a market for authentic Fruit Machine simulators?
This whole thing is really upsetting and bizarre and bemusing. I find it actually less offensive than the whole solitaire issue that got me so wrangled up in the first episode when we came back from break. One of the first amusing things this article notes is that you can buy this coin package for £154.99. You can buy a real Fruit Machine for £200. So you should just do that and put your pound coins in and take them back out when you've finished. This is the kind of thing that I used to sort of get really riled up about. But now I've found that there are just a lot of people who love playing Fruit Machines. And to be completely honest, if you're a Fruit Machine addict, and that's something that you really enjoy doing in real life, playing a simulated version of that is probably something that's quite fun and possibly even slightly healthy. The idea that you have to pay for coins to put into a fake Fruit Machine that you have no chance of winning anything out of is just completely ridiculous. And I think that the whole fact that it even exists just speaks to how slightly broken human psychology can be around gambling.
Yeah, this is kind of wonderfully bad. As you say, this is sort of the worst... This might be the worst free-to-play game ever, because you can't win. It's a gambling game where you only have the money input. It's so ludicrous. It's so ludicrous that this has happened. And as producer Jimmy brought up to me, we've had several Windows 10 items on this show where we're just talking about these crazy monetization things. And it really seems like they've just gone for the jugular. They've gone like, what is the lowest thing that we can possibly put in? And they've done that. It's just bemusing to me.
I really don't know what else to say about it. It's only relatively recently that I've found out the pure extent to which people who have plenty of disposable income are willing to just keep throwing money into games for sort of really, really sort of unclear any benefit items. And I mean, I'm not a person who plays slot machines. The writer supposes that you can't get money out because they don't want to come under gambling regulations, which is definitely possible. And it might just turn out to be this insane discovery that you don't actually have to pay people back in gambling games. They're just happy to gamble and see an electronic number go up. But really, I mean, I'm kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'm just wondering if you can even transfer these coins to pay for your solitaire subscription, or buy something from the Microsoft Store. I don't know. The whole thing is insane.
You win Windows wallpapers, I don't know. Apparently developers Ironstorm wanted to create a modern-day reboot of the Thief series after the relative lack of commercial success for Deadly Shadows. According to an internal pitch document obtained by Eurogamer, they were looking at a gritty and urban version of the game drawing inspiration from the Blade movies. Is this a lucky escape for the legacy of Ironstorm?
It's a lucky escape for everyone. Just a few minutes ago I was bemoaning the fact that we were on a radio medium, but now I'm actually celebrating it, because if not, I might have to show you what the concept image for the new Garrett is. It looks like it's a guy in a hoodie with a duffel bag. It just couldn't be less Thief if it tried. It's absolutely terrible. I am one of the world's biggest Thief fans, and the whole... Thief has good gameplay. Don't get me wrong, but the thing that makes me completely fall in love with Thief is its atmosphere. I love the world, this really crazy steampunk magic thing. It's got a great amount of darkness. I loved the cutscenes. This concept is literally taking the thing I love most and replacing it with being in a boring city. And, basically, it was going to be something very much like Splinter Cell. It was going to be their version of Splinter Cell. It was going to be called Thief 4 Dagger of Ways, which seems like a really stupid name as well. I mean, I feel quite mixed about Ironstorm. Obviously, they made Deus Ex, which is excellent, but Deus Ex 2 wasn't, and Harvey Smith, who has slightly redeemed himself with Dishonored, has always seemed like a bit of a monkey to me, and a lot of the decisions that he was involved with at Ironstorm tended to go fairly badly. So I certainly have nowhere near as much love for Ironstorm as I do for Looking Glass, the original developers of Thief. And I'm just really, really glad this didn't happen.
Okay, wow. I mean, I think I'm not going to allow you to get away with that dissing Harvey Smith, because Dishonored is one of my favourite games, possibly ever. Certainly one of my favourite recent games. So let's rehabilitate Harvey Smith in the small amount of time I get to respond to your ire. I mean, yeah, I think this would have been bad. I'm kind of glad it didn't happen. They use a word, I think the word might be unidentifiable about the setting of Thief, and that's something that I really like, and I wish more people would do. Instead of like, oh, we're going to have fantasy, we're going to have sci-fi, we're going to have cyberpunk. Make a setting that is unidentifiable. So the Thief setting has some really interesting elements of technology, some really interesting elements of magic. People have called it steampunk, but it doesn't bear much relation to any kind of other steampunk stuff. It's the Thief world, it's its own world, and that's really cool. And I think people, use the stuff that people like. It's got all the, bows and arrows and swords and magic and stuff. That's cool, you can have that, but make your own world. And you're right, this completely compromises that idea in the worst possible way.
Yeah, I mean, I like that idea. I can obviously understand all these execs running away in fear from these unidentifiable places, but that's what we definitely want. Yeah, I love Dishonored too, and I think that he has actually been redeemed by that. But Harvey Smith has been involved in quite a lot of weirdness when he was younger. And to be honest, I still haven't really forgiven him for Deus Ex 2. Deus Ex 2 was under him as a lead designer because basically Warren Spector felt that he owed it to Harvey Smith for some reason, because Harvey Smith had been really sort of, loyal and well behaved during Deus Ex's 1's design cycle, and I just wish he hadn't done that. I mean, Thief 4 itself, I've still only played a very small amount of. I think you've played a little bit of. I kind of really have no interest in it, and I didn't like Deadly Shadows very much either. It really compromised several of the things. Mainly, I actually think we could blame the Xbox for this, because one of the problems was the levels in Thief 3 were much smaller than in Thief 1 and 2, and the big sprawling levels with lots of different routes is like a massive hallmark of the series, and they were smaller absolutely because of memory constraints on the original Xbox, and that's really sad. So I sort of just need to kind of like cry quietly while playing Thief 2 and remembering the good old days, I suppose. I mean, it's I say I'm glad this didn't happen, but in some ways, at least a modern-day Thief 4 would have been so obviously egregious, and not just this boring terribleness of Thief 4.
Yeah, Thief 4 is bad. It's one of those things where they've tried to incorporate a lot of the feel of an older game, so it has a bunch of stuff that's quite interesting. You're certainly able to go to more places than you are in a lot of those kind of modern AAA open world games, but at its heart, at its core, is a boring modern console AAA game, and it is just really sad if you like the original Thieves. I still think Thief in general is a kind of unexplored genre. I know Neon Struct was an attempt to incorporate some of that, but that game didn't really work for me for a variety of reasons that I think I may have discussed before. But I really want to see someone kind of take up the challenge of, it was the level design and the setting that were the most interesting things about the early Thief games. I would love to see someone take up those challenges and get both of those things right.
I think it's very, very hard to do that. I was actually going to say I think this is one of the hardest games to clone, because it has excellent gameplay, but it really is all about the setting and the gameplay itself. I wouldn't like to see a Metal Gear Solid VR sim version of Thief's gameplay. I just think it totally involves, it requires being an explorer in these amazing spaces with this awesome story going on around you, and it's sort of less about the story than it is just about the general world. I love the builders, I love the Hammerites who worship the builder, excuse me. I think that it takes a high budget to get that right, and I think Dishonored is another game that needs a high budget and a very good artistic eye. I mean, there were fantastic computer graphics cutscenes in Thief that were a really important part of it. Great voice acting, a really long script and everything. I think it's hard to clone that.
Yeah, it certainly is hard. Amazon believe they have a new way of doing F2P which avoids the need for in-app purchases. Instead of offering virtual currencies and resource packs, developers can now opt to be paid $0.002, that's 1/5 of 1 cent per minute that the user has the app open. It is believed that Amazon will recoup this money by sometimes showing advertising when the app is opened. Is this the future of digital distribution?
No, it's definitely not. It's always dangerous making really declarative statements like that about the future of anything on the internet, which is developing so fast that it feels like the rug's been taken out from under you every day almost. But I am really, really, really convinced that games and books are premium products that people like to buy and then play. And I do not think that in general a subscription model or an ad-supported model for the kind of pay-once games that people like buying generally on Steam and playing, like the kind of games that most of the people listening to this would like more than any other kind. I really believe that is about the excitement of buying a game and playing it and buying something new, and the thing being new, being the thing everyone's talking about. And this has been tried a lot of times in the past. Game Tap is probably the highest profile one. And the thing is, even there were times when Game Tap had a really great catalogue, the kind of thing that really almost would rival sort of Netflix in terms of great content. And it never ever took off. People just are not that excited about playing old games all of the time for low amounts of money. So I'm really being hardcore on this one. I don't think this is going to take off.
Yeah, completely agree with you. I think this kind of time-based rental thing is a fundamental misunderstanding of how free-to-play works. Free-to-play is about building a large audience, and then it's about allowing the people who want to spend a lot of money to do that. I think everyone knows that now. I think we've had enough talk of games in different genres that all follow the same structure. It's about the high spenders, and it's about this kind of solid tranche of middle spenders, and then the free component is about spreading the game. And that's how it works. So you can't make a free-to-play system that's based on these tiny, tiny incremental amounts of money, because no one's going to want to develop for it, because it's not going to make any money. I just can't. It's so clear now that that's how this works. This is ridiculous. Why are people still trying to do stuff like this? Understand the limitations of the way free-to-play works. There's a lot of information out there, and just do that.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, so I agree with all of that. You're coming to this from the position that this is a new kind of F2P, which is in fact what your intro said. Fair enough. And I was sort of viewing this as just another way of trying to shoehorn subscription ad-supported stuff into pay-once games. In terms of F2P, as you say, F2P games have to be good, and that takes quite a lot of money, and as you say, everyone knows how to do that now, and this is just something else. I mean, I can understand why people would like to get into this because of the big change that's happening in TV to online subscription, and I would just say that TV is just not like computer games.
Marcus Persson, aka Minecraft creator Notch, revealed in a series of tweets that the money he got from selling his company to Microsoft has made him feel isolated and unproductive. This then became a relatively big news story, even being covered by CNN. Ian Hardingham, should Notch's emotional state be a news story?
I mean, the question is literally just about celebrity, and it's not about games, it's about whether or not the way we as a society crave information about celebrities and cover celebrities is okay or not. Like it or not, Notch is a celebrity. He's a very rich person, and that's enough sometimes if you behave badly enough. And he's also the creator behind something that's loved by a huge number of people's children and people. So, you know, really, it's a question and about celebrity, and I don't particularly mind. I think Notch quite likes being ostentatious at times, so I think he's not a complete recluse who is being terribly invaded by the press. So I don't think it's one of those really egregious examples.
Yeah, this is difficult. I think that Notch is somebody who never chose to be famous. He didn't go out and seek fame like a reality star or a musician. He is someone that's been propelled to fame and wealth through something that he's done. And I think that if you asked him, would you take all of that back and just go back to being normal, he would have to think before answering that question. So then this then becomes about, what do you do with someone who is in that position if you're the media? And he's reacted with incredulity that things that he's said have been reported in this way, and to be honest, I think that is the only thing that he's done which is unreasonable. I think that he's been through the experience so many times of having what he's said and what he's done be news, that expecting anything else when talking in public, I think now is not wise. So that's kind of the only criticism I have for him. He's clearly having a very difficult time, and he's clearly trying to use the support network of talking in public about that to help him. Whatever your opinion on that is, I don't think that you can say that he's done anything particularly wrong there. I kind of wish that the media would now just leave him alone, because he is not associated with Minecraft anymore, and I think part of the motivation in selling it was to get away from this attention.
Right. This isn't a celebrity talk podcast, so I want to try really hard not to try and predict what he's sort of thinking or feeling or what kind of person he is, or try too much myself to criticise his past actions. I will say that the one thing that he's done was buy the most expensive house in LA that's ever been sold. He outbid Jay-Z for this house. It's a very ostentatious house. So I think there's certainly been a time in the past where he has done something that I think you need to be very naive not to understand was going to court attention. In terms of myself, trying to move away from a specific person who isn't me for a second, if I ever had this kind of windfall, the most important thing would be that I would continue making games, because I know that it's a really important part of my life, and it's part of how my life functions, and my life would be, in some ways, a little empty without it. I think one of the saddest things about Notch's story is that one of the reasons he's not really actively making games is because almost every single person on the planet who might play his games is just massively emotional about Minecraft, and it kind of tires him out. He really did partially, I believe, sell Minecraft because he needed to get away from the intense pressure of Minecraft, and I wonder how long it'll be before he can sort of re-enter the industry in some kind of low-key way. I almost wonder if he should get a fake name and just start producing games under that.
I think people have suggested that, definitely, that he do things anonymously, or that he work on projects privately, and I think that it just seems to be that he's not able to do that for whatever reason. I just find it very sad that someone can't opt out of this process. I think that's the problem with this, is that the media process is so intense. Once you have that attention, you can never get rid of it. So for anyone wanting to achieve this level of attention, I think you've got to really consider that very seriously. It's a one-way ticket.
I mean, I think that's right in terms of photographers hanging off the top of a tree to take pictures of you in your boxer shorts. It's important to remember, though, that this news story is about a bunch of tweets he made. You know, I think if you are tweeting, I'm not sure that you are trying desperately to get away from the public eye.
Yeah, I mean, but that was sort of my original point, is that someone who is doing that for support when they feel bad is not inviting, they're not making a comment to the press. But now apparently that's not something you can do because it's effectively a public statement.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't, in a lot of ways I don't disagree with you, because I think if he'd made these comments on a more private forum, the same thing could have happened. This goes to the nature of Twitter, really. I think that, I feel like when you're tweeting out, if you tweet out that you're upset about something, anything, be it being dumped or having too much money or whatever, I think that you are in some ways making a public statement. Is that something you disagree with?
I think it's not something I disagree with, because that's the status quo. I think it's sad that that is necessarily true for a lot of people, that it takes away that avenue of talking in public. I mean, it would be an interesting world where nobody could quote in the media something that someone said on Twitter. I think that would make Twitter better, I think.
So for you, it's the division between you're using Twitter legitimately to make a public statement, but it being reported on is something that's a sort of a different matter. So
yeah, I mean, it's not something that you can, as I say, you can't make that differentiation now, and you should know that when you tweet, it can be quoted. I mean, I remember the first time that happened to me, and it's a very odd experience, because you've started to use Twitter as a sort of way to talk to people who know you, basically, and then like to think anything I say can be quoted on a news site is a really interesting mental transition. But I think everyone involved in games pretty much should have made that transition by now. But what I'm saying is that for people who have a large number of followers and a large number of attention, the avenue of using Twitter to vent feelings, which I think is useful, is basically gone. And I feel that must be hard for those people.
We can move off this topic. I genuinely, I'm going to have to put some thought into whether or not it's sort of valid to need to vent. I think maybe you and I view Twitter in a slightly different way. I think as a way of just interacting with your close-ish friends, that's a really nice use for it, and it's almost nice if there was something that was halfway between Facebook and Twitter that allowed me to do that. But certainly I kind of, in my own use of Twitter, I always view it as a public space.
Sure. Game history website The Digital Antiquarian posted a history of the mostly remembered for its difficulty Douglas Adams text adventure Bureaucracy. Now there's a sentence for you. Should modern designers have more awareness of the history of interactive fiction?
I'm not sure, actually. You're a big IF guy. You like IF a lot. I like it a little bit. It tends to take a little bit too long to play them for me. I'm not sure as a designer myself, as a modern designer, even sometimes. I don't know what I'd get from IF. What do you think I should learn from it?
I think that a lot of the more out there concepts that people come up with have been done in IF. So, for example, when Papers, Please came out, it immediately made me think of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, a large part of it involves filling in forms and doing very boring, mundane processes. So this game was inspired by Douglas Adams' experience trying to get a bank to change his address, which I think is a great inspiration for a game. It took him many years to achieve this, many different kinds of threatening, cajoling, and even in one case, proposal of marriage was involved in trying to get them to recognise his new address. So I think that there are some things, especially with these kind of more high concept art games, that it's kind of been done before, and it would be nice to have a bit of awareness of some of the game design.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what text adventures and IF that I've really been into in the past. There was a great one called Gorm on the Acorn that I really loved at school, but one of the reasons I loved it is that it had an actually drawn map that made it cool to explore and sort of unlock bits of the map, and it had like bits of graphics as well. So for me, once actual graphical adventure games came along, those were always more exciting to me. As a designer, I'm really a big fan of extremely well simulated systems that you can interact with in a lot of different ways that throw up a lot of emergent behaviour, and that doesn't tend to happen that much in IF because of how complicated it is to write every single reaction that can happen. Just for instance, it's a lot easier to do that with something like physics, where a small number of basic mathematical interactions can create a lot of emergent behaviour. So that's probably one of the main reasons why I'm not more into IF.
I think that quite a lot of IF does stuff like that. I mean, Deadline, for example, is a murder mystery game where the entire house is simulated and based on timers, and you go around observing characters' actions. And if you're in a specific place at a specific time, you observe an action, and then if you get seen, I think it changes the character's action. There's some quite complex simulation and stuff in some of the more obscure IF. And
that sounds great. I should play that.
Yeah, this is kind of one of the reasons why I think people probably should have a bit more awareness of it, because I think it's characterized as, people know Zork and stuff like that, and Zork is one of the worst IF games. It's a really bad game in a lot of ways. That series is not great. And there's other stuff. I think there's some really creative ideas. I mean, one of my favourite games is A Mind Forever Voyaging, which casts you as an AI who has to explore different simulations of a city and report back. And again, you kind of walk around and see what you can see, and then you sort of input the details of your observations, and then that sort of, the plot kind of goes on, and that becomes really important and significant in the plot later on. It's a really interesting game, really plays with the sort of player's identity and stuff like that. So yeah, I do think that there is this sort of slight lack of awareness. I agree with you, a lot of these games are very hard to play. I mean, there's an interesting sort of Lost Treasures of Infocom type thing for iOS that has quite a few of them that you can buy and play, but I do think stuff like the lack of maps and the UI of a lot of these games does make them obscure. I want people to raid them for ideas and make more accessible versions, I think.
Well, those sound great, and I will try and play them.
Good. YouTube launched their new gaming portal thing last week, the somewhat obviously named YouTube Gaming. The service provides hub pages for individual games where you can find streams, LPs, reviews and trailers all collated together. They will also offer coverage of major events like they did for this year's E3. Ian Hardingham, is it too late for YouTube to enter the streaming arena?
No, I definitely don't think it is. I think if they turned up tomorrow with all of the same functionality as Twitch, I think Twitch would be in really serious trouble. YouTube is absolutely huge, in case you hadn't noticed, and they have the clout to definitely do something like this. So it'll be interesting to see what this is like. I really like Twitch. Maybe both can coexist. In general, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of features so far, but I'll keep watching it.
This is the social network problem for me. I think you need to be where everyone is already, and everyone is already on Twitch. So they're going to really have to do some stuff that is very bold and innovative to get people away from Twitch, or Twitch is going to have to run into some significant problems. And I just don't see that happening, and I certainly don't see it happening with their initial offering. So, but these things can evolve over time. You know, the MySpace kind of dominance thing would be the classic thing to talk about, and how they lost their community. So I think them being in the game is probably sensible. There are other minor competitors like Hitbox around, but I don't think they're really comparable.
Don't see where there's the same barrier to entry against having two or more sites like there are in social networks. Like, maybe I'm missing an important feature here, but it feels like just as I might go to two different channels to see TV or two different websites to get my games news, I could easily go between Twitch and YouTube Gaming to see a different competition.
I think that's fair enough, but I think a lot of people are, just because they're simply already on Twitch, they're partnered with Twitch, they understand how the ad revenue stuff works, all of their streaming stuff is set up to go via Twitch, that shifting to a new service, there's going to be a lot of inertia there. If you're a streamer and you have everything set up, ready to go, and you just press your, on-air button and off you go, you're going to have a real reason to do that. Subscribers is a huge deal on Twitch, so if you've got a lot of subscribers who are paying you, you'd have to convince them to all move as well.
Sure, I think that in terms of existing streamers, I don't think that they will move. I agree with that. But in terms of, you've always talked about how the most important thing in being an up-and-coming streamer is to do things that other people aren't doing. So stuff like streaming in the middle of the night or streaming obscure games. It feels to me like YouTube doing this will open up a massive new audience of people who've never heard of Twitch before, and you'll get loads of new people trying to be streamers, and there's no reason why some big guys can't come up there as well.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's a slight misunderstanding of what I've said in the past. You actually have to do very conventional stuff, like stream big, famous games that people have heard of, but just at slightly different times. Because people will want to see anyone playing the new Metal Gear Solid game at this one time at night. That's kind of the conventional advice there. So this, again, I just don't see why you would go to this first, or why you would move from Twitch to this yet. Maybe they have something in the works that's gonna do that. I think that yes, maybe people will make content for both. Streaming to two places at once is pretty difficult. I'm just not seeing it yet. I think it's interesting.
I just think YouTube are going to introduce a whole load of new customers. It's as simple as that. If something as giant as this, because a lot of people still haven't heard of Twitch, and YouTube will be able to position streams on websites that millions and millions of people are looking at. And I think it's just a simple fact that this is kind of a giant entering the arena, and it's just opening up a massively new market.
Interesting. Okay, so that's predicated on them introducing people who are new to watching streams, which I think is just that's not an aspect of this that I would necessarily have thought of. That's interesting.
It does depend how much they care about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I could definitely see them not doing that. I was just kind of assuming because, we've talked about... there are lots of people who only watch things on YouTube and only consume things on YouTube, even when there's a better place to do it. So it just feels like YouTube has a big enough sort of standing crowd that they might be able to quickly get some new people. But it's all supposition and yeah.
Intriguing. In their ongoing quest for verisimilitude, EA have added an option for coloured contact lenses in Madden NFL 16's player customization. What makes this actually notable is that the option is locked to only one player and one colour. It's Buffalo Bills defensive lineman Mario Williams and his distinctive red iridase. What's that word? Who knows? Why not coloured contact lenses for everyone, Ian Hardingham?
I don't know. This feels really old-fashioned. Why can't I have blue contact lenses in my made-up player Ian Harding man or something? I don't know. This is really, really upsetting to me. Get on with it, EA.
Ian Harding man and his distinctive heart-shaped pupils. Yeah, people are going to want this now. This is going to be a thing. Honestly, I despair. I despair. A few things have made me despair on this week's show, and this is one of them. The state that sports games are in now, where you have to add a feature just because this dude has these stupid contact lenses, and also, why is he allowed these in the first place? I've seen a picture of him. It looks terrible. Like, if you're facing him down, it's clearly to intimidate the opposition by looking weird, and I think it should be against the NFL dress code. Why isn't it against their uniform code?
Well, that's very interesting because a large section of people tend to sort of cry racism when the NFL disallows certain things from their dress code. Everyone likes to claim that it's sort of a coded way of stopping certain groups of people wearing certain things. So I think if they came down heavily on Mario Williams' red irides, I think that they come under criticism again. So I don't know. I mean, there is a dress code, you're right, and maybe that's fine for that to include. You know what? I'm just completely stumped by this whole area.
I can't. What if tennis players start wearing like masks that have horrible images of dismembered people on them? I mean, like, it just. And now it's time for a regular feature of the show. It's not the film and television lounge area, which we've postponed till the end of the show for reasons that will become apparent. It's time, in fact, yes, for Ian's Magic Corner. So take it away, Ian.
Hello everyone, welcome to Ian's Magic Corner, where Ian stumbles over some kind of piece of interesting Magic the Gathering news every week. We have a very small and easy to understand thing to talk about this week. I was talking to Visiting the Village Magic the Gathering correspondent Tom Richards at the weekend, and he told me about something very cool that Wizards of the Coast did a few years ago. I think this will amuse you, Paul. For the original Zendikar block, which came out a few years ago, in a very, very small number of booster packs, the packs of cards, Wizards did something rather strange. They bought a bunch of very expensive old cards on the secondary market, including Black Lotus and other Power 9 cards, and put them in the very occasional booster pack, which I just think is absolutely ridiculous and really awesome. They bought second-hand cards from someone else, put them in new booster packs, and these cards are no more legal to play when you bought them in Standard than they were before. So they were still only playable in Legacy, and they called them Treasure.
That's absolutely fantastic. Every time I hear about something Wizards do, it just seems like they just like having fun with their own game, and that's really cool. I wish more people would do that. I'd love Blizzard to bring out like a card that you have like a 1 in 10 million chance of getting, that is a card that will just let you win every single match, and it's also tournament legal. I think that'd be amazing. I think that would be absolutely amazing if they did something like that. I mean, this isn't that far off. I guess these cards were banned, most of them, from tournament play, but it's not far off.
I think that sort of the reason this came up is because for this new set that's coming out soon, they're doing something somewhat similar. They are bringing back the treasure concept, but it's reprints of quite exciting old cards, nowhere near as exciting as these ones, with all new art, etc. Which sort of seems like much of a saner thing to do. I just can't really get over the fact that they were buying old cards from other people and reselling them. It's just really bizarre. But that's the whole point. If they had reprinted these cards, even in very, very small numbers, they would be changing the economy and changing the marketplace, disrupting it. And I think how you reprint cards is actually a very, very difficult decision that they make for those reasons. So this is why Ian's Magic Corner exists, because Wizards of the Coast appeared to be an endless source of fascinating decisions.
They really do. Right, now it's time for the games that were released this week in 2005, thanks to Eurogamer. So I'm going to go through these this time, I think. So the most interesting thing we've got here is that it's the European PSP release date, and there's 24 PSP games here. So, Ian Hollingham, is there anything interesting in this launch lineup? It's quite an incredible batch of games.
I never remembered that the PSP had 24 launch titles in Europe. That's pretty cool. Metal Gear Acid was a weird card game in the Metal Gear Solid universe. That was obviously quite popular.
Yeah.
The Wipeout Pure was a very important game. That was the game that everyone showed you when they were showing off their PSP. Lumines, also very important. Really, really bad game. Sorry, Lumines fans.
I thought you liked Lumines, actually. The only thing I remember about Metal Gear Acid is that I think it was a something awful Flash animation in this year, and in it the guy said Metal Gear Flaccid. And every time I see that game, I just hear that voice going, Metal Gear Flaccid, as a kind of parody of bad gamer reactions to things. So I can't get that out of my head. This is a pretty good lineup. But again, it's that Sony thing where there's no big sort of... I mean, I guess Metal Gear is probably the biggest IP, but it was a weird game. Like, it's this big collection of stuff.
I mean, even back in 2005, the era of the absolutely amazing launch title was pretty much over. I think you could probably make a case that Halo on the Xbox One was the last one of those. No, I'm not a fan of Lumines at all because the games last for far too long. If you're playing well, it can take you half an hour to lose in Lumines, which is way too long for a stupid block game. I like its stablemate Meteos, which came out on the DS and was quicker, and I like a lot more.
Right, so on the PC, we've got Dungeon Siege 2, which is a well-regarded RPG. I think a lot of people have heard that one. Earth 2160, which is kind of a semi-popular RTS. The Earth series, I believe people like. That's quite a good week on PC. MotoGP Ultimate Racing Technology, we'll ignore that. On the Xbox, you've got Aquanox The Angel's Tears, which is, I've forgotten the name of the game that this is the series from, but it's the submarine kind of exploration combat thing. Do you remember those games? They got submarines in them.
Vaguely.
Yes.
If I can just stop you for a second here to talk about Earth 2160.
Yeah.
I think this might be one of the first times on the 10 years ago segment that the game I actually bought has been on this. I think Earth 2160 is the second in the series after Earth 2150, and this was back when I was still trying to keep my passion for the RTS alive. They were quite good games, but this was still sort of after that genre kind of died for me.
Yes, indeed. I must find this out about Aquanox. Archimedean Dynasty is the first in those games, which is another one of those sort of sub-combat games, and it was published by Blue Byte originally. Yeah, and then people like these games. I think you can get them on GOG now. I'm genuinely intrigued by this because I kind of like the Wing Commander-y, freelancer-y stuff, so I might give those a go. Nothing else interesting there. Aquanox on PSP, PS2, and Xbox in the same week. Pretty ambitious. Delta Force Black Hawk Down. Yeah, and
to finish off the list, Brave: The Search for Spirit Dancer, which I would just assume was something to do with the Disney movie, but the Disney movie wasn't released back then. And Digimon World 4. So Digimon World must have been very successful to get 4 games in the series.
And now it's time for the top UK Steam games this week, catapulting you into the present. In one moment, I shall break them down. Just allow me to centre myself. Okay. At number 10, it's Deus Ex Human Revolution. Number 9, it's The Elder Scrolls Online Tamriel Unlimited. Number 8 is Rocket League. Number 7 is the Deus Ex Collection. Bit of a theme. Number 6 is CSGO. Number 5 is Ark Survival Evolved. Number 4 is GTA 5. Number 3 is Act of Aggression, the newly released. Number 2 is Mad Max, also newly released. And number 1, big surprise, is Metal Gear Solid, not Flaccid, 5, just released. Any comments?
Act of Aggression is an RTS.
Yes.
So, obviously, people are still buying RTSs. I'm slightly surprised that's at number 3. I'm going to have to check that out and see if there have been good reviews or anything, and that's why that's happening. I'm also a bit surprised that Mad Max has got to number 2. It's been really marketed, so let me be clear. I'm more surprised by how much it's been marketed than I am by how successful it is, given that it's been marketed, but that's cool. I'm going to get Metal Gear Solid next time I have any time to myself, and I'm going to try really hard to play it properly because everything I've heard about it so far is really, really exciting to me.
Yes.
And it sounds a little bit like Jagged Alliance 2 in some really exciting ways.
I definitely want to try that too. The Mad Max game, I believe, is not very good. Is that right? I think I read a review that said it was not good, but it's just been heavily promoted, as you say. Deus Ex, lots of hype around whatever it's called, Mankind Deciphered. That's not what it's called. It should be. So that's why that's there. The Elder Scrolls Online is a weird thing that keeps popping up all the time, and I'm quite tempted to try it. I hear that it's not good. I saw a video which was just, I think it was Jim Sterling, just constantly complaining about how clunky it is for the entire video. But it does intrigue me, and it's there because of 33% off with some DLC. So now is clearly a good time to jump in. Right, that's going to be enough of that. I think quickly, before we move on to reader questions, I just wanted to mention, we've talked about this in private, but I'm really enjoying The Swindle, which is Dan Marshall's recently released roguelike stealth platformer thing. You played it and you didn't get on with it that well initially, I believe.
Yeah, I played it again and I still didn't get on that well with it. I still found the controls to be a little bizarre, and it didn't kind of... I'm sure that it gets deep and everything, but the first level kind of didn't really do a good job of showing off any system that I was particularly interested in. So I kind of want to keep persisting with it, but I'm not sure I'll get a chance to.
I'd really recommend that. I think it's one of those games where it does start off at a kind of slow burning pace, which is one of the reasons I prefer it to Spelunky. And two of my absolutely favourite things in the game are you have the ability to choose when you leave a level. So you go in, you kind of appraise the level, you get some loot out, and you go, oh, I don't really fancy that room, I'm going to get out quickly. And also, if you do alert the guards, the police then turn up and chase you around, but you have a good amount of time before they do. So as soon as you make a mistake, you have a really interesting set of decisions, which is, do I have time to run in there and get this? Do I want to push it? And then finally, if they do arrive, you can really push yourself to try and make it out of the level before they kill you. So there's some really interesting stuff there. The progression's really nice. The controls are not amazing, I would say. I am lamenting the lack of a short hop jump. You really want to have two different kinds of jump. You do get a double jump later on, but it would be nice to have something in there by default to make jumping feel a bit better. Attaching to walls is a bit difficult, so those are really the only negatives about the game for me. I massively do recommend people check this out. It's certainly one of the most interesting indie games of recent times. So yeah, maybe if you persevere with it, you might get a little bit further there.
Yeah, it sounds generally good, and I may do.
Let's move on to your reader questions now. Alex Connolly says, does early access dilute launch day sales power, and is there a sweet spot for length of early access dev time without that? Yes, so this is a difficult question, actually. I don't really think it does. I'm not really aware of any titles where that's specifically happened.
So you didn't read the full question, which is a pity, and I will do so now because I want to focus on the things he said at the end. He actually said, is there a sweet spot for length of early access dev time without garnering consumer disinterest or Cortex command syndrome? And he's thinking of the great but seemingly forgotten Invisible Ink. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to start with Invisible Ink. I don't think Invisible Ink has had any problem due to being in early access for a particularly long time. It wasn't in early access for a particularly long time, and it got very good reviews when it came out and sold pretty well when it came out, and has now fallen beneath the waves, just in the way that an awful lot of indie games do now. In fact, the vast majority of games, because there are so many games coming out each week. So that, I think, is a completely different subject. Cortex Command syndrome implies that there's any other games like Cortex Command, which I don't think there really are. Cortex Command was in early access for a very, very long time, and I think was in early access significantly before Frozen Synapse 1. And it really alienated all of their customers by having a very strong initial offering and then spending a long time not really working on the game at all, and then sort of finally flubbing it out of the door, not really finished in any sort of meaningful way. So again, I think that's an interesting example that's not actually particularly relevant to this. I'm pretty strong that I do not think that early access, in being in early access for a long time, can cause games any problems. But Visiting the Village mobile games correspondent Adam Hunt said that he thought there was a possibility that you were losing hype at launch because a lot of your existing fan base had already bought the game. Do you think there's anything to that, Paul Kilduff-Taylor?
It depends on how long people play your game for. I think if it's a game that people only play for a little bit of time, they don't stick with it, then you will lose some people sort of advocating for it. But then if people like it and it comes out, then there'll be threads where people say like, oh, I got this and I really enjoyed it 2 years ago, and that's going to convince some people to play. So I'm with you. I'm not really big on this kind of early access dilution. Invisible Ink was in early access for 2 years. Or at least it was available for 2 years. I don't know if it was specifically in early access for all of that time. So it might be a candidate for that, when it was originally called Incognita, of course.
I did not realise it was 2 years. That's a very long time. I still don't think it had any impact on what happened with Invisible Ink.
Yeah.
But that is longer than I thought.
Yeah. This is always very difficult to know, but I think for any devs who are worried about this, then don't. Like, there's no good evidence yet that early access can cause anything negative about your launch, unless your game is really terrible, in which case it shouldn't be on early access anyway.
And the advantages of early access, such as finding out that your game is really terrible early on, are so great that they outweigh any concerns about this for now.
Jason Forster asks, with relevance to our Mentalist discussion last week, are there any other favourite shows or games you would have ended, or whose ending you disliked? Ended sooner, rather. I think I probably would have ended Star Trek sooner, because I think there are quite a few seasons of Star Trek which just are bad. I mean, Voyager I don't like, and the reboot is awful. I think we would have blocked the reboot entirely. So I guess Star Trek. Any games I would have ended sooner? I'm trying to think about that. There are quite a lot of sort of narrative-driven FPSs that seem to go on for a really long time and have a lot of padding. I really liked Prey on the Xbox 360, but there's a lot of slog levels in that, so I definitely would have ended Prey earlier. Have you got anything for this?
I don't generally have a problem with games going on too long, because I'm quite happy to stop playing them, and in some ways I sort of like there always being enough of the game to keep playing. I was watching Boston Legal this morning,
yes,
which is a show I like a lot, and the 4th season of that's absolutely terrible and becomes all emotional and schlocky in a really, really boring way. So I wish they'd finished that. I mean, I don't like the endings of a lot of things, really. I mean, that's just sort of not that unusual, so nothing particularly jumps to mind.
Miodrag Kovacevic says, do you think lowering the execution barrier in fighting games takes away from their depth, or can it emphasize it? So that's talking a little bit about our conversation about Rising Thunder. Now, I have played Rising Thunder now. I don't think lowering the execution barrier takes away from their depth. It certainly doesn't in Rising Thunder, which basically only gets rid of special moves, and all of the other things about fighting games which people find difficult, which I think are more significantly difficult than special moves, are still in there, and I've had a bit of a conversation with the devs about that. No, I basically think that if you remove execution barrier, it really emphasizes the real depth in fighting games, which is about the competitiveness.
Yeah, I find myself confused trying to work out whether I think that any of that is necessarily true. I don't feel like the execution barrier is an important part of the depth of fighting games. It seems like a sort of an almost orthogonal skill curve that you get better at almost independently of getting better at the other elements. Does that mean you take away the depth? Yes, I guess a little bit. I mean, I still don't find that a very satisfying part of fighting games, so I'm not particularly in love with it. And can it emphasize it? Yeah, definitely. When you remove something that's hard that maybe shouldn't be hard from a design, you can definitely emphasize the other parts that have good depth.
Sander van Dragt says, why are most MMOs so focused on combat? I could imagine a successful The Settlers or Animal Crossing MMO, but they're not here. This is really interesting, and it's going to relate something to something Cheshire says a bit later on in these reader questions. I think that there could be a much more interesting implementation of Animal Crossing. It's something that I've said before. I think Animal Crossing is very limited, and that's probably because its audience is largely children, really, if we're being honest. I think it's really aimed at children, and the adults who enjoy it are kind of just wringing enjoyment from a children's product, sadly. But I would like to see a much fuller thing based on building, hunting, catching bugs and stuff, because I think that would be really fun. Do you think...
Well, that might be the most inflammatory thing you've ever said on our podcast.
Really?
We're going to get letters about that. I don't know. I mean, to a certain extent, I thought Animal Crossing was kind of an MMO, but I guess it's not really. It's got some very mild multiplayer features, doesn't it? I feel like there are some more child-focused MMOs that are a bit like this that exist. Free-to-play games come about. There are a lot more different kind of MMOs. I suppose that Sander is correct that the majority of really heavily marketed MMOs are sort of fantasy combat-y things. But it feels to me that the alternative to that at a basic level is something like Second Life, where it's mainly about just interacting and building, I suppose. I'm trying to work out what an MMO The Settlers would be like. That would seem to me to be a bit like Farmville.
Yeah.
And not really... I don't really know how you'd have a meaningfully massive multiplayer experience from The Settlers. And I think Age of... what's that? Age of Empires. Wasn't the last version of that somewhat MMO?
Possibly. Very possibly.
I've forgotten, so I don't have a definitive answer to this.
Yeah.
It's hard to make a random genre work in an MMO setting.
I think that's true. I definitely think that there are, as we kind of explore this survival thing, the combat in survival games is sort of quite... It's important, but I don't know if it's the most important thing. And as I was saying recently, I think there's a lot of design innovation comes about when people pick on a thing from a game that they like and just massively overemphasize that. So maybe we'll see a more sort of building, farming-ish MMO. I don't know, maybe. Another question from Sander. He says, do you think free-to-play and full-price games have a future in gaming, or do you think people's pricing expectations will change? We talked about this a lot in the past. We both very strongly think that free-to-play is a growing and dominant force, but that some types of game will always have to be full price and will always exist. I mean, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I possibly have a slightly different balance personally than what you've just said. I think that they will both absolutely continue to be very big and very important separate ways for different games to be sold.
Alrighty. Mr. Hahn says, how do you feel that the connection between your music and your games have benefited each other? So I guess I'll talk about my point of view, really. It's nice to be able to make something which is entirely done by me, the music, and then put it into the environment where we're all collaborating on games and discussing everything to do with them, including the design and the aesthetic and so on. So I think it's really nice that I have a direct hand in something creative like that I am basically a developer on the game as well as someone who's just sort of telling other people what to do and having conversations with them and stuff. I think beyond that, actually, those two things are kind of separate. I wrote an article this week about things that I believe music and game design have in common, but I don't know if they've necessarily benefited each other. I guess you like it that I'm an in-house musician and I can make music that suits the games, right? I suppose. Yeah,
I like how good the music is. The music's great, and really, it really honestly adds to the general atmosphere of the games. I think especially FS, I find the FS soundtrack to be really really unique amongst games like that, and I think really add to it. But I mean, it's just if you have an amazing, it's really amazingly high quality, the music, in my opinion, dude, and that's awesome to have in the game. I mean, in terms of trying to answer this question straightforwardly, whether the music has had an impact on the game design or other elements, I suppose I'll sometimes be walking around the fields near here listening to the music for the game while I'm making it, and because you often make the music pretty early on in the development stages, and sort of imagining and fantasizing how different things will work, and I suppose there could really be like a subconscious link there.
Yeah, I guess also in terms, I haven't really talked about how the games benefit the music specifically. Games basically allow me an avenue to make music that otherwise wouldn't find an audience. If you make electronic music that isn't dance music, it's incredibly difficult to make money from that as a career. It's just unbelievably hard. There's probably fewer than 20 people in the world who do that honestly, and some of those people really don't make a very good living at all. If you think of some of the great artists on Warp Records and stuff, I know for a fact that some of them have big financial problems, and it's only the ones that have got lucky with TV licensing and stuff that have managed to do that. So this is kind of one of the only ways that I can make music that I want to make as a sort of sane career. So I guess that's the main benefit that the games give the music. We've got a special section for long-term fan of the show, Dave Cheshire Coleman, who wrote me a very interesting response to last week's episode. I'm going to take some of his points and questions and we're going to address them. So on matchmaking, he says, I hate the 50% win rate target for league thresholds in various games like StarCraft and League of Legends, of course. Why not use something further up the bell curve? Why not 70%? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to try. 70% is probably too high, but 60% might be reasonable. Yeah, I would like maybe a little bit more texture to the leagues. Having said that, you know, people are often drunk when they're playing, and you're not going to play up to your full potential all the time. So there already is some texture. I think it's a really, really, really complicated thing, and someday I'd like to read a book by maybe one of the Blizzard guys about how this actually works rather than how it feels like it works. Something
I would really like is, it's nice to have unranked play, which is good, but sometimes I'd love to deliberately choose an opponent who's much better than me. Because especially in StarCraft and Smash, because sometimes I find that in fighting games specifically, when you play bad people, your own play gets a lot worse. I think you've said something about tennis, with that being true in tennis as well sometimes.
Right, yes, yeah, sure.
So if you're trying to get better, sometimes playing a load of bad people at once, which can definitely happen in fighting games, is really bad for you, and you want to just go up against someone great and have them kill you, and then sort of look at what they did and have a new target for your gameplay. So that's something like...
Yeah, that's very true, actually. I don't know the exact sort of number, but if you want to get better at the fastest rate, you're probably better off playing someone who's always at least one level above you.
Yeah.
Not so far better than you that you can't even play. You know, I'm not gonna do very well from just playing Andre Agassi at full strength every time we play. But you're gonna get so much better. I mean, I remember F-Zero X is a slightly funny story, but I found that I got so much better when I was playing on the hardest difficulty setting, even though I was never winning, than I had been playing on the other difficulty settings. And I think that's a good way to improve. So I love your idea, actually, of being able to sort of apply to go and play in a higher league for a period of time.
You have the hard button. That would be good. Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting because you definitely need... A lot of these games, it's about how much you play. The main factor in how good you are is how much you play. And if you have to play a lot of good people all the time, you will get discouraged and stop playing. Even the most dedicated person in the world will be discouraged if they constantly lose all the time. So you need to have some people that you can beat up. Also, with some games, as you say, you need to have the chance to play. So if someone capitalizes on every mistake you make perfectly, you won't be hitting the ball very much, or you won't be hitting them very much if it's a fighting game. So you need both. I'm going to move on now to his second point that I've drawn out, which is about linearity in open worlds. And he says, I think open worlds need a driving force to make them engaging. Sometimes that's combat, sometimes that's a story, but whatever it is, there's a progression to it, and it creates linearity innately. I'd love to see a counterexample and see if it worked. So I think you're going to agree with part of this and not with some of it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I don't think... I'm interested in exploring this.
Yeah.
I think the extent to which open world games, be they online or single player, need, in inverted commas, a driving force is really, really interesting. The game that we're currently working on, that's actually an issue that is coming up almost daily for me, trying to work out what the right balance is.
Yeah.
Because, as we've talked about, whenever you start imposing a direction, you always make the game feel a bit less open. But I definitely agree that being thrown into a sandbox and given no kind of direction or no kind of scoring for your actions is terrible. That's the kind of thing that's good when you're already massively into the game. You know everything about it and you can start setting your own challenges, and you definitely can't do that right at the beginning. So I'm interested in seeing what the right balance there is. I don't think you necessarily have to make something linear to give it direction. loads and loads of open world RPGs have a central plot line that you can choose to take part in whenever you're unclear of what else to do next. So I don't think it's necessarily true.
I'm going to sort of respond to this by offering a slightly weird suggestion. I would like to play an Elder Scrolls game where there is no main plot, but there are still like the big, very well-developed sort of semi-major plots, like the guild plots and some of the side missions, because I feel like the main plot in these things is the thing that makes me feel most like it's this boring kind of standard game and it affects the whole world. I mean, Oblivion is the classic one. It's been talked to death about how bad the Oblivion gates are and so on. So I would like to play an open world game that's predicated more around a group of good main missions rather than a single one that has everything thrown at it. I think that commercially is almost impossible, but I would like to play that.
Well, I think that the existing alternative to the central plot line is a game where it's very hard to survive, because that's what produces the drive. So something like Dwarf Fortress or some of these other survival games, they're really good because they don't give you a sort of a ladder to climb. They just give you this very dangerous thing that you have to keep running from, that forces you to learn quite quickly, and drives you sort of from behind rather than from in front. And that's really awesome when it's appropriate to the game. It's very appropriate for Dwarf Fortress. I'm not sure it's very appropriate for the Elder Scrolls. So there does exist another example. To address your point specifically, I think it's an interesting point. I'm not as offended by the main plotline stuff as you are, but I would be interested to see what that was like.
Yeah, I just have that problem where if characters are coming up to me and going, the world is going to end and you have to do this, you feel compelled to do it. I can't ever shake that feeling. Whereas what I want to do is explore the world, and that feels ludicrous in the context of, you know, people telling me that I have to go to this town or else something bad's going to happen. I don't like the ludo narrative dissonance that creates.
Yes, that's true. There is that in that.
On that note, right, so we're going to conclude with the television and film lounge area. And the first thing I want to talk about is a movie that we both like a lot, and this is the movie Daybreakers, which is a kind of early-ish 2000s Ethan Hawke vampire movie. And the conceit of this movie is that society has been taken over by vampires, and it's the humans who've been forced underground, which is a really great premise. It's incredibly stupid, and I think very underrated. Would you agree?
I do. I like it because it's well shot.
It is.
It's actually quite sort of stylish. It's fast moving. It's got good performances. It's not terribly written. And it's just like quite an exciting world to explore. And yeah, it is very, very stupid.
Yes.
But stupidity is fine as long as things are sort of moving fast and it's not horrible acting. So I was really pleased that you saw that. I'm a big fan of that, and I really wish there were more films like that.
Yeah, it's this sort of mid-budget sci-fi-ish thing. I mean, it kind of looks like everything's got this permanent like chrome filter on it, which is a bit annoying. But as a counterpoint to that, it does have Sam Neill as the bad guy businessman vampire. And when he's not chewing the necks of his victims, he's chewing the scenery. So,
well put.
Yes, I do like this. There's some quite funny vampire lore in it as well. They have to drive around in these cars that have all the windows blacked out, and they have cameras on the front and side so they can see a little screen when they're driving, which is so dumb. Like, that's like the worst solution to that problem ever.
I don't want to spoil the film for anyone, but the way that a vampire can stop being a vampire is really pretty hilarious. I think you have to dive into a pool of water while the sun is shining or something.
Yeah, they discover this. It's absolutely ridiculous. So Daybreakers. Now we're going to move on to the movie Ex Machina, and I just want to say, if you haven't seen this movie or you're the kind of person who is offended by spoilers, then you should stop the podcast at this point. It's going to be the final topic. So if that's you, goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Okay, so spoilers ahead for Ex Machina. Now, This is a difficult one because it defines something I'm going to call in movies fumbling the premise. So you create this amazing premise, and the first maybe half, maybe third of the movie is a really nicely executed setup for it, really elegant. And then there are different ways in which you can fumble it, which in my terminology means that you just remove everything that was interesting about the premise entirely. And I really feel that Ex Machina does this, and I think there's a couple of sort of specific points where that happens. I believe you like this a lot in general.
No, actually, that's not quite right. I generally agree with your thing. My biggest thing that I feel about this film is that I'm an absolutely gigantic Oscar Isaacs fan. I think he's very good in this, but he's kind of, it's only you see him being utterly brilliant when you kind of see all of the films he's done the last couple of years and see how he manages to nail a lot of very, very different parts. So I really like him in this.
Yeah.
I agree that the ending's pretty bad. And I think that it kind of just goes downhill about half of the way through. So no, I'm not a big fan, although having said that, I still kind of think it's a 4-star film.
Yeah, I would actually probably, if I was reviewing this for a normal publication, I would give it 4 stars, because I think it's so ambitious. So the point at which it became apparent that it was stupid for me, which is always important with fumbling the premise, is the scene where they go into his lab and he starts talking about the way that the AI was created. Because prior to that, there's a great scene where the programmer guy... So if you haven't seen the movie and you don't care about spoilers, the premise is that a guy gets randomly selected from this company to fly out to basically this kind of bro Steve Jobs, this guy's house, and he has to administer a Turing test on an AI robot. And they have a scene where he starts kind of offering different theories as to how it works, and the bro Steve Jobs beard guy goes, no, I'm not going to tell you about technical stuff because it will colour the process. I really like that. That's a good hand wave. And then they go into his fucking lab, right? And he says, oh, I got her to learn language because I turned on every camera and microphone on every cell phone in the world. In the world. He says in the world. And that's how this AI has been able to learn about human interaction. Every cell phone in the world. It's stupid. It makes no sense. It's absolutely...
It's pretty weak, and I agree that if they just managed to keep up being very abstract and kind of avoiding the issue of technology, it would have been better.
Yeah.
I mean, I think maybe I didn't find that quite as annoying as you, because I find just the idea that someone would have been able to create these... The thing about the cyborgs in this film is that it's far less believable to me that he could have made them look like humans and be so perfectly looking like humans than it is that he would be able to make the AI in the first place. You know, as far as sort of leaps of faith in films go, the idea of a genius web enterprise guy managing to create AI is nowhere near as implausible as him managing to pair that with making perfect skin and perfect robot, you know. So the whole thing was kind of a bit unbelievable to start with for me. I really liked... There was one specific thing I loved about the film. I really like interesting structure in films. So whenever it would have this kind of thing where there'd be a big piece of tension and then sort of a fade to black, and then it would sort of do session 3 or something, and the day would start again. And I'm a real sucker for that kind of thing. So yeah, I thought the ending was just too much, but I did enjoy it.
So the whole thing is very sort of Diet Kubrick, like the extra diegetic titles that you mentioned and the geometric framing, and it's like it very much would have been better if it was a Kubrick film, and it kind of knows that, so that's fine. The other thing is, like, as you mentioned, you have to, the suspension of disbelief is so great. Like, you have to basically believe that bro Steve Jobs beard guy made everything himself, because as it becomes apparent later on, there's sort of, if anyone else was involved with this, it would be too ridiculous, and that creates this really interesting problem, because you're able to suspend your disbelief, and you have to believe that this guy is like the most intelligent superhuman person who's ever lived. He's basically the technological mentalist. You have to believe that. And then the whole thing is based around her convincing the programmer to help her escape. And that is like the ultimate test, because she has to use empathy, she has to manipulate him, she has to understand kind of all the context of the world and so on. Has to have self-awareness. And I quite like that, even though that doesn't really make any sense. But the mechanics of how that happen are so bad that it involves bro Steve Jobs guy letting the programmer guy hack his security system so that when there's a power cut, all the doors open. And yet he doesn't anticipate any of the ways in which allowing him to have that route of helping her escape could go horribly wrong and result in his own death. That's the problem that I had. It would be so much better if there was a situation where everything in his plan worked and she was able to escape, and then you have a scene with the three of them, because there's no scene where they're all there. All three of them have a really interesting relationship, and that's never explored, and instead you have this dull, sort of banal, thrillerish ending. So I feel like I fixed that movie.
Yeah, I think that the ending is bad. I do think that quite a lot of the middle is good. I quite liked learning about Bro Steve Jobs' relationship with the robots. I quite like the darkness in there. I quite liked the whole thing about her basically kind of getting him to think she's in love with him. That was okay. I thought that was kind of like nice twist and stuff. Yeah, I do wonder slightly if the set budget was a little low on this, because while it was all very glossy and very well shot, and the sets they did have were really, really nicely done, I started to get a bit bored of being in these corridors, and they sort of felt more boring and less, I think, as they were supposed to, inciting of claustrophobia. So that didn't quite work for me, but that's kind of a minor point. But yeah, I did enjoy it.
Right, that's Ex Machina, and that's the end of this week's show. We hope you've enjoyed it, and that you'll join us next time. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.